Welcome to an information webinar on the project that's about to be completed, which conducted a life cycle assessment of Rubus, raspberry and blackberry production in Australia. It was funded by Hort Innovations, using funds from the Raspberry and Blackberry Fund, so acknowledging the levy payments from growers in the industry, as well as federal government funding. The Onyeka Netsi from Hort Innovation was a project manager for this project. He sends his apologies. He can't attend today. And I'd like to also acknowledge that this project was supported by a very active project reference group, which was made up of people from a range of berry growing organisations that were interested in contributing to an industry-wide understanding of what the environmental sustainability metrics for rubus production in Australia look like. So this project was exploratory, aiming to gather information that we didn't already have about environmental performance of Australian rubus production. You'll see from the title, we're going to be mostly talking about the carbon footprint, which is the greenhouse gas emissions intensity. But there are, we also looked at water use intensity, but the results were not as insightful as the greenhouse gas results. So we're focusing on that today. We're also very grateful to have been supported by some farms that acted as case studies in the early stages of the project that helped us get an understanding of Australian rubus production and to model production systems adequately. I'll take the opportunity now to introduce the project team who are online here today. So it was a joint effort. Myself, Marguerite Renouf, I was the project lead. Then we also have Beatrice Reuter, who's here today, Kathy Jang, and Anna Boyd, and I thank them for their work on this project. They visited farms, talking with growers, collecting data, and then analysing the data to generate some metrics. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Anna. Beatrice. The next slide will give us just a snapshot of what we're going to be talking about today. Because some of you joining haven't been involved in this project before, we'll just talk a little bit about what we aim to achieve in this project. And then we'll describe a bit about the methodology we used, the scope of the supply chain system that we were interested in, the data sample that we had that led to the analysis results. Then we'll talk about, as I mentioned, one of the main results from the life cycle assessment, which was the carbon footprint, which represents greenhouse gas emissions that are generated over the life cycle of a product. And of course, one of the reasons we want to do that is not only to sort of know where the industry stands, generate some baselines, some benchmarks, but also to consider if we wanted to reduce those emissions, what might we looking at doing? What would be our priority things to target? And then at the end, we're talking about some of the resources we could leave the industry with. We had a great opportunity over the last year and a half to work with growers in a fairly new process that growers have of needing to compile data about their processes to use in initiatives such as this. So we'll be talking about some of the data gathering tool that we're planning to leave the industry with at the end of the project. I'll be doing quite a bit of talking at the first part of the project. If you've got any questions along the way, please put your hand up and we can take questions as we go. And then we should also have time at the end for questions. So you can either throughout or at the end. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Beatrice. The first thing we want to do, just to get us warmed up, is we'd like to know at the end of the project, whether this presentation today helped you understand a bit about life cycle assessment and carbon footprinting. So we'll be wanting to ask you a few questions. It's not a formal survey. It's some questions that we can easily ask you using this software called Mentimeter. I don't know if any of you used Mentimeter before, but it's something you can give us feedback via your mobile phone. So and this little section here is just to get us warmed up, get our Mentimeter set up on our phone so that we can use it. So I think you know the drill. Use your camera, scan the QR code. It'll ask you for a code, which is 66736014. The top there, 66736014. And it's a warm-up question. Tell us what your favorite way of eating rubus is. This is not part of the survey. It's just to get us making sure that everyone can use this. After this warm-up question, we do have another little question to ask you in preparation for learning about life cycle assessment and carbon footprinting. And that is just while people are still putting their responses into the warm-up questions. You'd be aware that the life cycle of growing rubus starts right back at when resources are extracted from the environment to make fuels and fertilizers, and they get supplied to farms on trucks, and then they get used to grow rubus. So most growers are very focused on what happens on their farm, but they draw in inputs from other places in the economy and in their supply chain. And then after they produce berries into packaging, it got put into cold storage, and then it becomes part of a distribution supply chain and perhaps ends up on a supermarket shelf or in a retailer. Well, I think we've got most people ready for the next slide. So in this next slide, asking you to have a bit of a guess. This is even before we've talked to you about what life cycle assessment is. Can we go to the next one? Sorry, I got my order wrong. Based on what you know of about greenhouse gas emissions, and what you've heard of, and what you know about rubus production, have a bit of a guess at what part of the supply chain or what aspect of growing rubus do you think might make the biggest contribution? We sort of generally know that, using electricity and burning petrol in our cars, etc., are all important. We know about concerns about using fossil fuels or plastics, etc. So this is just a starting point. Have a bit of a guess. And then at the end of at the presentation, when we talk about the results, we'll actually give you what the real answer is, and we'll see how much of a surprise it is. I think a few people are hedging their bets here. I think we're bit of an even spread across everything, and you're all right that all of those things do make a contribution. And yeah, the answer for fertilizers is a bit insightful because for many agricultural crops, fertilizers are a really important source of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a pretty good answer there. Great. Now, if you want to go back one slide, Beatrice, and I'll ask one more question. This is just to get a sense from our audience of how much background knowledge they might have on the topic of environmental life cycle assessment or carbon footprints. So let me know if you know a little bit about it. You're thinking, I'm actually not sure what it is, or whether you got a smattering of the basics, whether you've got a bit of a medium understanding, or whether you're a bit of an expert. You've done this before. Now, some of our audience are actually from the project team and from Lifecycles, so I don't think it's fair that you answer this question. So because we'll have you all as senseis. Okay, so someone knows a little bit. I've taken the assumption that some of you here perhaps haven't been too exposed to this area before. So we're going to spend the first slide or two just giving a bit of a background. Okay, we've got a couple of people there. No, a little bit. Okay, good. Let's move on, Beatrice. Okay, let's start talking about the scope of life cycle assessment. I introduced a bit earlier that we're really interested in looking across the supply chain and understanding how our production systems interact with the environment, either by consuming resources from the environment or emitting things to the environment, which can be problematic in the environment. So they're inputs to our production system and outputs from our production system. And we look at those things across the supply chain, and we sometimes look at the whole supply chain, cradle to grave, like right from when they take natural gas out of the ground, turn it into fertilizer that goes into make growing rubus. We put it in plastic packaging, which also has its own life cycle. It goes into our refrigerators. We might have some losses along the way, and things then get put in the bin at the end of the day. We can do a whole cradle to grave, but you don't have to do a whole cradle to grave. We will often do a partial scope depending on what our purposes are. And for Hort Innovation's project, the purpose was to understand the cradle to farm gate profile. So it went up to the production of rubus berries in their packaging at the farm, which we've observed is where quite a lot of packaging happens. So we're not looking at distribution trucks that take it into supermarkets and then into the home. We are just looking at what the rubus production sector mostly has control over. So it's the nursery production in some cases, or the establishment phase of the berry plants, and then you have the core productive period where berries are being produced, nurtured, harvested, and then the packing, typically on farm, and some cold storage. And for each of those steps, we aim to generate data for the inputs, so how much water, fertilizer, electricity, chemicals, packaging is coming into each of those steps, and then what sort of wastes are being generated, what sort of emissions there might be going to water or to air. And for the project, for the stuff we're talking about today, we are most interested in greenhouse gas emissions. And so that comes from the release of greenhouse gases to the environment. That could be from fuel burned in a diesel pump, could be electricity that might be generated from burning coal, etc. Even the fertilizers we mentioned, nitrogen fertilizers, can produce a gas called nitrous oxide, which is also a greenhouse gas. So we count all those things and we add them up per kilo of berries. Next slide, thanks. This has a little bit more detail. The purpose of showing this slide is to give you a sense of the extent of items that we collected data for with the growers that were involved in the project. The orange boxes in the center of the slide are what we call the foreground processes. So that's the core processes that happen on a berry farm: growing, harvesting berries, packaging berries, putting them in cold storage. So they're the things that are happening on the farm. On the left side, the green boxes, these are other processes that are happening and inputs that come into the berry production process. There are plastic and metal that goes into the production of tunnels and trellises and lots of other things. There's water and electricity goes into the irrigation and fertigation systems. There is fuels, and electricity might be used in farm vehicles, tractors, etc., and electricity for pumping, for instance. So that's the stuff coming in from the left-hand side. And then there's also things that come out from the right-hand side, including wastes like spent substrate, spent plants, packaging that will then go off somewhere else to be treated, recycled, disposed, etc. So we captured all of that stuff. We were as comprehensive as we could be, and there's well-established guidelines on how you do this, the rules that you follow, and they're quite specific about how comprehensive you need to be. So this project, we were very comprehensive. So the data collection process was quite involved, and we're grateful to our growers that went through the sometimes time-consuming process of compiling data when they might not actually be in the habit of collecting all of that data. Next slide, thanks, Beatrice. Talk a little bit about our data sample. The aim of this project was to produce some average metrics for the carbon footprint that was representative of the industry. And to do that, we needed to have a sample that represented the ways in which berries may be grown in different parts of the country, because we wanted an Australian average. So one of the first tasks was to identify, where rubus is grown, understand through consultation with our project reference group how production might vary from region to region. Climate can often significantly influence how agricultural commodities are produced. We wanted to get a sense of how much it varied and whether we should be generating average results region specific, or raspberry versus blackberry specific, or whether everyone grows everything exactly the same and we can just lump it all together into a single Australian average. As you'll see from the results, we did feel there was justification in looking at raspberries and blackberries separately, having separate metrics for those, and also differentiating between the northern production systems, Queensland, New South Wales, and the southern production systems, Victoria and Tasmania. We were able to have a sample of participants' data that allowed us to represent about 20% of the production on a hectare basis for the industry, which is not too bad. It's no easy task to actually find enough growers that are interested to offer their time for this. So we were quite pleased with that. Next slide, thanks, Beatrice. So we can now start to look at some of the results. This is for the carbon footprint, which is the greenhouse gas emissions intensity. The kilograms of greenhouse gas as a carbon dioxide equivalent that are generated over our system scope, so our cradle to farm gate scope, per kilo of either raspberries or of blackberries. So the first thing to mention is, and this is Australian average. So we haven't split the result into different regions here. It's just all of our sample brought together on a production weighted basis to give an industry average. And we show raspberries and blackberries separately. And of course, the first observation is blackberries is lower. And the main reason for that is because blackberries, a slightly different fruit to raspberries, is generally higher yielding, has higher yield per hectare. So per unit of inputs that are, so for all of the greenhouse gas emissions divided by the yield to give it emissions per kilogram, the blackberry number comes out to be lower, mainly because you produce more per unit of input, more per hectare for blackberries. So yield is a really quite an important determinant of the greenhouse gas emissions intensity per unit of product. And the numbers that we land on there is for raspberries, 2.2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram, for blackberries, 1.7. Now the unit, just in case you're not so familiar with this, the unit is of kilograms of CO2 equivalent. CO2, carbon dioxide, is a greenhouse gas that we're all aware of. It's produced from burning fossil fuels, but there are other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide are two important examples. And we convert methane and nitrous oxide to a carbon dioxide equivalent to allow us to add them all together. Methane and nitrous oxide have higher global warming potentials and carbon dioxide. So let's look now at the sources of emissions, which we can see from the breakdown in those graphs. The first thing I'll point out is that the bottom two categories, yellow for energy inputs, so that's electricity, fuels, and the second green item, the sort of darker green, is for fertilizers. So that's the production of the fertilizers, and then the emissions of nitrous oxide that occur on the farm after the fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, are applied. Those two together are always they are often the key contributors to greenhouse gas emissions for agriculture generally. Any agricultural crop will have those two things quite dominant in their profile. So that's not any surprise at all for rubus berries. That's quite consistent with other crops. But the other ones in the bar graph, the orange, which is that phase of growing the plug or the tray plants, maybe transporting canes from one site to another. That process of just getting a productive plant into a production is the orange. The lighter green is packaging. So that includes both the plastic punnets and also the cardboard trays. Pink is other. Did I get them mixed around? Sorry, the pink is the plant production. I got that wrong before, sorry. And the brown is the protected cropping infrastructure. So that's the embodied emissions in the plastics of the tunnels and the trellis material, for instance. So those top ones, the trellises, the pots as well, the potential transport of plants around the country, and the packaging are quite characteristic of rubus being a very perishable crop that needs to have quite a lot of packaging to keep it good, and also to protect it from rain, wind, etc. So that protected cropping system adds quite a bit to the carbon footprint, which is a little bit different to agricultural commodities. But other sorts of vegetables are also grown in similar ways. So could we have the next slide? Thanks. The next one will help us put those numbers into perspective, because those numbers of 2.2 and 1.7 don't really mean too much unless you can compare with something as a baseline. And this graph compares the numbers that we generated with some other carbon footprint greenhouse gas impact results that have been reported in published studies for other horticulture-like crops. You can see it's got vegetables and cereals and rice and different things there, and included the ones that we're interested in comparing our numbers with is the fruits, which are grown in the field, and the passive greenhouse fruit and veg on the right hand side. So that's what the literature is telling us has been reported, and our numbers are generally in the ballpark of that. The numbers we're comparing with were also quite old, perhaps representing production systems of maybe 10 years ago, so it might not be a fantastic comparison. But generally within the spread of numbers we're seeing for horticulture type of products, our numbers are in the ballpark. So we're reasonably content that we haven't overestimated or underestimated things too much. Okay, next slide. These results give us a chance to look at any potential regional differences. And I mentioned that from early in the project, we could see that there was some differentiation between northern systems, northern New South Wales, Queensland, and southern systems. And the results sort of gave an indication of that as well. But we also need to mention that our sample was spread relatively thin across those different systems. We didn't have for each regional area, we didn't have a very large sample size. So there might be, it hasn't been the perfect sample for giving us a really clear picture of how much each region compares. But it does show there may be some sort of differences, and the differences seem to be, again, yield, maybe different yields in the different areas has some bearing. But energy use for irrigation, so the northern regions are using more water and pumping more water with more energy coming in. But another factor that we noticed is across our sample, in terms of electricity use, there were a fraction of the farms that had adopted solar power. They had photovoltaic panels on their farms, which were contributing to the energy provision, and they were either sort of using the PV to supply all of their electricity or partially supply their electricity. So within the whole sample, we did have represented some farms that had quite low grid electricity input because of the solar. We kept them all in the sample, and the Tasmanian Victorian sample did actually have a few more sites in it that had the PV, which sort of perhaps skewed it down a little bit. But it did actually, one thing it did show us is that it is quite an important variable for the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of Rubus. Those farms that have adoptive solar are having sort of lower emissions intensity. It's quite an important variable. Next question. Just a chance to pause if people have any questions up to this point. Please feel free to raise your hand. So that's the picture that we've been able to obtain. So it's telling us that the numbers we have for Australian Rubus production pretty much sit comfortably within the range that's being published internationally. We don't have a lot of studies to compare it with. As more industries get on board, that will change, and the industry will be able to benchmark themselves internationally. It sort of suggests that we should have metrics for raspberries and berries separately. It also suggests that there may be value in having slightly different benchmarks for northern systems and southern systems. And it tells us some of the things that are contributing the most, which are the plastics and the infrastructure for controlled production, and the typical energy input and fertilizers. And the next step is to think about how we can use this information to inform what strategies the industry might want to have in the future. Some individual farms or collectives of farms are perhaps starting, the industry and the horticulture industry as a whole is starting to set up sustainability strategies where they might want to include greenhouse gas emissions reductions as part of that. Just a point I didn't make on the slide previously was horticulture products, including Rubus, do tend to have low emissions intensity compared with other food products generally. So the starting point is a relatively low emissions intensive industry, but all people have growing obligations to do their bit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this piece of work that Kathy and Anna completed recently was to test which of these initiatives on the y-axis would give you the best opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And as we alluded to before, having non-renewable energy available on site, in this case through solar voltaics, can make quite a dent into your greenhouse gas emissions. So this scenario here represented a scenario where you would change over to 100% of your power being supplied by photovoltaics. That's one scenario. Of course, if you had less than that, it would be less of an impact. The next promising one is any sort of yield increase, which is really common for any agricultural commodity. The more products you can produce per hectare, the lower your emissions intensity per kilo of product. And then the emissions embodied in packaging, plastics and cardboard, is another potential target for making improvements. We've suggested here in our scenario what it might look like if you were to try and reduce the emissions intensity of the packaging by say 30%. Now, we didn't specify how you might do that because there are lots of different ways you can do that. You might be looking at different sorts of packaging, lightweighting packaging, etc. So it wasn't specific to how you might achieve that because we're aware that the industry already has quite a lot of initiatives in train for how that might be achieved. Because on-farm fuel use, tractors, not so many tractors, sorry, farm vehicles, was reasonably high in the profile. We modeled the scenario here of what if farms were to make a transition towards electric vehicles. Say if you replace 50% of your current vehicles with electric, what sort of impact could that have? And it wasn't bad. But potentially a more capital intensive investment. And then the other ones down the bottom were interesting because they were the ones that you might have perceived would have been perhaps really important target opportunities. For example, the embodied impacts of the tunnel infrastructure, particularly the plastics, seem to look fairly substantial. And a 20% increase in the durability, which means you're replacing them 20% less. It's modest, but it's certainly not something that would give you sort of large gains. And then fertilizer, particularly we're talking nitrogen fertilizer here, which is the nutrient that sort of generally carries the highest embodied emissions. If you reduce that by 10%, either by being more precise with your application or feeling that you could cut back on the end application rate, or changing your losses in your drainage from the pots, number of ways you could do that as well. That's typically a really important initiative for broadacre cropping systems, but in the context of Rubus, it seems to be less lower down the list. So worth looking at, but not necessarily a high priority. And then the other one, when we started to see the data coming in and the results in the early stages of the project, the embodied impacts associated with pots seemed quite important. We saw a lot of variation in systems. Some people reusing pots a lot, some people getting 5 crops, getting 5 plants through one crop, versus one pot used once and then not used again. We saw quite a lot of variation. We thought it might be something important. But again, if you improved your reuse of your pots, it could make a difference, but not huge. So one of the reasons we were interested in having this workshop, inviting people beyond those farmers and growers that we spoke with in the project, was give you an opportunity as well to talk to us about any initiatives you've thought about, or initiatives the industry is pursuing. Any surprises from this? Any things that you thought you might have been important, but don't seem quite so important? If you're interested, you're welcome to put up your hand, put something in the chat.
We do have a comment in the chat, Marguerite.
Thank you. I'm having a look at that now.
Just wondering, if we looked at the costs of these different initiatives compared to each other.
Yes, thanks, Bronwyn. No, we didn't, but it's a really good question. Of course, the next step you would take from this would be to do a sort of an economic cost benefit analysis, just to see what the trade-off between the farm profitability and the environmental improvements would be. We've worked with other agricultural sectors that have done that. And interestingly enough, we haven't tested it for rubus, but interesting for other crops that often there's a pretty good correlation between the farm profitability benefits and the, say, greenhouse gas reduction benefits, because they both seem to be hinged on efficiency of inputs. So generally, if you're efficient in your use of resources, you sort of get benefits equally for both. So we haven't come across many situations where there is a trade-off. But of course, that's the thing to consider is the capital expenditure, which is often the key determinant. And no, we haven't done any of that. But this work could feed into any of that sort of work that could follow down the track. Okay. Beatrice, could you move forward? I just want to see what the next slide is. Okay. So we can, before we sort of go into getting some more feedback from you for using the Mentimeter, and just any last minute questions before we move away from the content? But while you're thinking about that, we'd love your feedback on these questions. Has this very brief overview given you a little bit more insight? Has it brought up some more questions? If we've totally left you flummoxed, let us know, because we can always go back and sort of clarify any confusion. One of the reasons we're interested in knowing how this helped you was we're coming to the point of finishing up the project for Hort Innovations, and they really like us to make sure that we engage with the sector, let people know what's happening in these projects, and for us to let them know, how much we think the project has helped people understand this space a bit more. So this is very helpful. Next slide. Is there another question? Okay, well, I'm wondering whether we could go back right at the start. One of the Mentimeter questions was what we thought the biggest impact area might be. And I'm just going to see where the results landed. It's taking a little bit of time, isn't it? It was a bit of an even spread. So yeah, fertilizer, I said at the time, fertilizers is important, but from the graph of the results, it was probably about 20%, I think, or 20 to 30%. So yep, it's an important area, but in this case, not dominant as it is with other crops. Energy, yep, fertilizer and energy, and all of those other bits, except transport. There wasn't much apart from on-farm transport with the fuel use. That has a factor. We didn't go downstream from the farm to see what the impact from transporting berries through retail was. So in terms of the full picture of transport, we don't have a full picture of that yet. But yeah, infrastructure certainly has a bearing, and packaging. But pesticides less so. People often think that pesticides will come with impact, and they can do in relation to, say, toxicity when pesticides get into the waterways. But in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, they don't rate very highly. Only very small quantities are used. And so the embodied emissions of producing them and getting them to farm are usually very, very low. Okay. Thank you. Right. Well, that's everything we wanted to say. If anyone else from the project team thinks I've missed something, now's your chance to chime up. But I think if you were interested in following the outcomes from this project, Hort Innovations has this project described on their website. So if you went to the Hort Innovations website and you put in Rubus LCA you'll be able to find a project page for this project. And at that page, they will, I'm assuming that from that page, they will give you information about the project, who to contact for more information. Thank you for attending. We were grateful for your involvement.